This episode is brought to you by our friends over at Fume. Fume cartridges are crafted from medical-grade polyester designed for use with essential oils. Fume, a non-vape, non-nicotine, non-tobacco device, works by replacing the hand-to-mouth fixation, calming nervous tension through fidgeting, and distracts you from the bad habits with delicious flavors. Psychologists have shown stopping a bad habit cold turkey is very hard for your brain. The Fume handheld device has a built-in fidget, also has a weight similar to most vape pens. If you're interested in replacing old bad habits with new good habits, head on over to tryfume.com/D410M and get yourself a free pack of toppers with your purchase. The toppers is a perfect new accessory designed with your comfort in mind. Slip it onto the mouthpiece for a softer, warmer feel. So replace those old habits with a new habit, a good habit. Simply go to tryfume.com/D410M. That's tryfume.com/D410M.
Digital 410 Media proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts, Don Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Dennis Blocker.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, your favorite World War II-based podcast, and we are here with another exceptional episode we're so excited to get to tonight. Real quick, little house cleaning. Jeff will not be joining us tonight. He has some family concerns that need to be taken care of, but once again, we shall carry on like we always do. But joining us, as always, Mr. Dennis Blocker. Dennis, how you doing tonight, sir?
Doing excellent. Super excited to have Mr. Newman with us tonight, talk about the book. And I always love having writers on. Being a writer myself, I have so many questions, and super stoked.
Yeah, I'm so disappointed that Jeff couldn't be here because he's talked up this book. I think over the last 2 episodes when we have the What You're Reading segment, Jeff has been talking gleefully about this book. And so we are finally going to get into it with our audience. And joining us from the East Coast as well, Dr. Roger Newman. Roger, how you doing tonight, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Thanks for coming on with the book you were promoting, your new book, Boys. Before we get into it, because Dennis and I are both extremely interested in your writing styles. It's one of the things we like to ask authors when they come in is their process, their research, and then we kind of get into the book. But even before that, just give us the elevator pitch on your background, your employment, things, notable things you've done in the past. What kind of got you in this particular subject, and what led to writing this book?
Well, I'm a physician. I'm a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston. As long as I can remember, I've always wanted to write, but medical studies and early years of practice, I had stories in my head, but I never had the time to. Didn't know if I could write, but as my career moved on in medicine, as I got later in my career and began to slow down some of my clinical practice and moved to really part-time, and also when the kids kind of finally all graduated, high school and went off to college, and decided it was a time to give it a try. So around 2014, I wrote my first book. My first couple of books were medical thrillers because it's what I knew. It was the stories I had in my head. Then after doing a series of 3 of those, I decided I wanted to try something else. And I've always been intrigued by history. So I did a historical fiction novel that touched on some of my wife's family history about a blockade runner during the Civil War. And then cool. After finishing that, I was thinking, well, I ought to do something on my side of the family. So I dug into kind of a story that I had grown up with from my father's side of the family, about him growing up with a black brother, and they're growing up together and going off to fight World War II together. And I just thought that story had always intrigued me as well, so thought it might make a good book, and so I started working on that about probably 2 years ago.
How does one go from taking family told stories? I'm sure there's some handwritten letters, some abbreviated documentation around, but how does someone take those stories and turn that into a full descriptive, full color book and bring it to life and the characters in such a beautiful way?
Well, in this case, it was, as I know you've probably talked about other people on your show, a lot of World War II veterans, which my father was, did not talk much about the war. And I think in the acknowledgement of this book, I make some note to the fact that one of my greatest regrets in life are all the conversations I never had with my dad.
Yeah.
So the information that I had about his military career and what he did in the military was really very slim, and that actually required more research. Uh, the stories about him growing up um, as came from family stories. Not a lot of them, again, because he was estranged from his grandfather for a number of reasons. But talking from the stories that I knew and from talking to my siblings and the children of some of my father's brothers and sisters, I was able to get a good bit of information about their early growing up. Uh, Alex and Pete, who are the two characters in the novel, they're growing up together in Leakesville, North Carolina during the Great Depression. Um, so that I had a framework for a story there. A lot of it is filled in with fiction, but I tried to keep the heart of that story in place. And then, unfortunately, I know that my dad and Alex went off when World War II started. After they graduated high school, they went off and enlisted together in the North Carolina National Guard, which eventually became the 30th Army Division, the old Hickory Division. But they were immediately separated because of their different races. And my father nor anyone else in the family ever heard from Alex again. There's no records that I've been able to find as to what might have happened to Alex, um, which probably is a result of a fire at an Army archive during the 70s.
Yes, my
But
family is also a victim of that fire. My grandfather, my mom's father, he worked grave registration over in Europe, and we've discussed this in the past. And much like you were alluding to, their generation didn't discuss it because everybody was there. They were humble. They didn't want to be considered braggadocious. But sadly for us, the following generations who are trying to keep this alive, with the exception of those who are lucky enough to have handwritten letters, maybe correspondence from our grandfathers to their sisters or wives, what have you, because we did the honorable thing, which was not to pester dad or pester grandfather about these horrible memories. They were unable to communicate those stories so we can carry on what they did. And that's the downside of us having respect for our elders back then.
yeah, it's like I said, it was something I wish I hadn't. I wish I'd have been more persistent
Yeah.
uh, every day. He was in the 120th Infantry Regiment of the. I don't know what company. I not. I'm not positive which company, but he was in the 120th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Army Division.
Was he in that famous Hill 314 where they held back the German panzers on that hilltop?
Absolutely, and that's a big
Big,
part of the story.
great chapter in the book.
Yeah.
He was on top of the Hill 314, they called it,
Yeah.
and the Battle of Mortain, which very in my opinion, an extremely underappreciated battle of importance.
And to
I
that point,
the
your
the
book.
reason
Go ahead, Dennis.
the reason that I asked is my great grandpa. I had two grandpas and a great grandpa in World War II. My great grandpa was in the 30th Infantry Division, 120th Regiment, and he went with them across the Normandy beaches that were, of course, D+4, 6 or something like that. And so he was at Mortain and all that. Went through France, then into Holland. And then they crossed over, and he was killed 27 October 44, and he was killed in the Aachen, the siege of Aachen. So there's a huge connection there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And there's a Dutch Belgian family, the Meer family. They put flower. They have adopted his grave, and so we're Facebook friends with them, and we've sent them tons of pictures of him. And matter of fact, a couple days ago, the Meer family went out to Henri Chapelle American Cemetery, and where a lot of the 30th guys are, and they sent us pictures of roses on his grave. Um, so yeah, our family has a huge connection to that unit. 120th. Wow, what a small world.
When I started doing this book, I really didn't know about that story, and it's research that I did um, about my dad's unit and the 30th. And since finishing the story, I've added. I would love, and I hope I can. I'd love to get over to Europe and go to Mortain, and apparently there's quite a lovely memorial to that battle at the top of Hill 314, and I just love to see what my dad looked out over and saw those
They
days that
were
he was on top of that hill.
they single-handedly held back six Panzer divisions, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken, and they're credited with saving the saving everything. I know that when
right.
the Battle of the Bulge happened, that they plugged in the 30th because they were Old Hickory and they were reliable and they were a veteran. And
The Battle of the Bulge would have never happened
that's right.
if the 120th Infantry hadn't held uh, and repelled the German counterattack at Mortain, because the Germans were what the reason they committed all those panzers and all their Luftwaffe and all the troops was they wanted to uh, break through the American line and cut off Patton's Panzer. I mean, not Panzer, but Patton's uh, art,
Armor.
tank
Armored.
armored divisions that had taken the breakout from Normandy and had raced across the middle of France on their way to Paris. And if the Germans had been able to take Mortain and push the Americans back to the port city, and I'm not sure I'm saying it right, of Arvanches, uh, if they could have done that, it would have completely cut off Patton's armor from their resupply, and they could have picked them off. And who knows how much longer that the battle for Europe would have taken if they hadn't have held and repulsed the Germans at Mortain and allowed what they called the breakout from Normandy to continue. So it's just that battle in and of itself is great history that isn't well enough known. If there's any light on that, that would be something I'd be proud of.
Well,
For
it's
sure.
interesting you're referencing the Battle of the Bulge, and as we all know historically, the reason it's called the Bulge is because the way it bulged, the front line bulge. But Hill 314 would almost be like the Battle of the Island, right? Because they're completely surrounded. They're up on the
They
hill.
were.
They're completely cut off, taken hammering, and the idea that you're completely surrounded, and much like the Battle of the Bulge, you're low on ammunition, but you had to basically rely on, let's be honest, less than accurate airdrops. I mean, part of the reason why the losses on D-Day were so high is because the aircraft didn't quite hit their marks to create the craters on the landing beaches, so we have places to get out from the fire. And now you have these guys basically pinned down on top of this high ground, because everybody knows when it comes to combat, you want the high ground. He who holds the high ground wins. And they're trying to hold on to that with the minimums, and then they're just, and we heard about the Battle of the Bulge as well, right? Oh, here comes the airdrops, and there they go right into the German
Yeah.
lines. I hope that was just socks and not.
At one point at Mortain, when they were running out of they were running out of ammunition, running out of medical supplies and food. But the really critical aspect of what they ran out of was that their batteries on their radios were were going dead. And the reason that Hill 314 was so valuable is because it allowed the spotters to call in artillery on all the German activity that was literally all around them. So they tried to shoot uh, shells. I forget the size of the
Yeah,
shells,
that's
but
right.
apparently the artillery was shooting shells filled with medical supplies and radios and
Yeah.
uh, into their position, which was probably only maybe 100 square yards or something like that. I don't know how big it was, but
You
it
know,
was dangerous to have your artillery bombing you with supplies.
they
And
say,
enough of it what survived the impact that it did prove the difference,
Yeah, some of the radios would survive. None of the My father was a medic. None of the plasma or anything like that survived. But food and some of the food and the radios were successfully delivered by rocket shell.
don't ever miscalculate the durability of a K ration in a can of spam.
Yeah,
But it's like they say necessity is the mother of invention, but desperation is the mother of insanity. I mean, just could you imagine presenting that idea? Hey, I got an idea. We're going to take an empty shell casing, we're going to stuff it full of goods, and we're going to lob it up there and hope that we don't hit somebody in the process. And if we do, it's casualty of war. Just the whole concept of that is crazy.
yeah, yeah.
Just
And also, no, one of the other things they did at Mortain again was, as you said, they tried the airdrops, but Mortain was a relatively narrow target on top of a hill with swirling winds, and if you just missed by a little bit, you know, 25 yards, it was tumbling on down the hillside into the German hands.
and statistically, when you're surrounded, there's more areas you don't want that to go than there are areas you're looking to hit. So yeah, I'm sure
Yeah,
a large percentage of that was completely lost. And just I don't know, just the idea of being in those situations where taking artillery fire, taking small arms fire, and knowing that I gotta have economy of bullets here, right? I can't just lay down endless firepower because I have limited clips. I have limited rounds. Even
right.
their machine guns had limited rounds. And
Yeah,
people don't give enough thought to logistics of, that sort of thing. Plus back then everything's super heavy, right? Mortar shells are heavy, ammo's heavy, the equipment in and of itself's heavy. So, you're already going in trying to move up this hill, packing as light as you can, but taking as much as you can with you. But in that situation, it's one challenge after the other.
right, right.
Yeah, I got to interview like I think 3 or 4 guys from the 120th, and my grandmother, she had the letters from her dad, um, and so I remember being at her house up in Wisconsin, Rhinelander, and I was like, "Grandma, who's that picture of that soldier there?" And she's like, "That's my dad. He was killed in World War II," and it floored me because how do I not know this? And she brought out these old letters, and
That would have
what I
been
loved
wonderful.
about the letters was on the female, at the top right corner, it was, Private First Class Frank Sobin, 120th, 30th Infantry Division, 120th Regiment, 2nd Battalion, Headquarters Company. And that was awesome because I know, okay, well, look up 30th Infantry Division Association, right? The Old Hickory Association. And I asked them for current members from that particular unit all the way down to the company level, and they were able to provide it. And it just so happened that one of the guys, Forrest Hodges, who I talked to, he was a best friend, a foxhole buddy of my great grandpa, and he actually had, I guess my great grandpa had collected Frank had collected coins from all the countries that they had gone through, and he had 3 kids of his own back home, one being my grandmother, and so he was a very affectionate to the kids and put them on his lap and shares meals, and he actually befriended families on the way, and um, but all these stories were things that we had no idea, and I was just so thankful that I had taken had the idea, and Forrest was able to tell me how he died there
That
in
was
Aachen.
that's wonderful that you were able to
Yeah.
track that down.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, Forrest Hodges, and he died a couple months later, so I got it right in the nick of time.
The headquarters company that your grandfather was in, uh, they were in the village of Mortain. I forget which the other. I think D and C or maybe part of an F company. Those are the ones who went up on top of the hill, but the headquarters company stayed in town, and they took a hell of a beating because the Germans just showed up in the middle of the night in mass, and they basically overran the town initially, but then the town was able, the soldiers there were able to fight back. So the headquarters company took terrible losses but fought heroically.
My gosh. It's odd, isn't it, how they don't the generals obviously knew the significance of the 30th and what they had done. I know they got the Presidential Unit Citation, I believe,
They
but
did.
yes, but it's just odd because they actually saved everything. They saved the whole shebang.
Let me read
Well, I'll
this.
tell you one thing uh, that I discovered I read in a couple of different places about the 30th Division. Uh, and I don't know how much of it reflects things that happened later on. But the 30th Division was originally a National Guard division from the Southeast, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. And the regular Army looked down on National Guard divisions. And I read in one place that the and they had a regular army general named Leland Hobb who really fought for them to get included in the fight, but they weren't allowed to land. One source I saw said they weren't allowed to land on D-Day on D-Day because they didn't trust the National Guard unit to be the tip of the spear. And in a couple of other places, I saw references to how the 30th kind of had um, a feeling that they were abused sometimes, didn't get reinforcements, got given bad assignments. They always, had to lead the way in certain bad areas. They just didn't feel like they were treated right because they were originally a National Guard division. And again,
What's really interesting too is that, and again, history hasn't really highlighted it, is that when that gap was punched in the Battle of the Bulge, it was the 30th that came down and they beat them back. And it was
yeah,
those old veterans that came down and once again they plugged in the gap and just unleashed some veteran hell on those Germans. And they were very instrumental. And it's just I've heard some of the, I've read, of course, the dispatches and things like that, and uh, writings from the newspapers and this and that, and they do mention the 30th, but for some reason historians have just, I don't really understand. They did so much, and then taking Aachen. I mean, Aachen. They offered to, just give up the city, open the city up, and of course the Germans were like, no, we're going to fight for every street, and okay, here we go. And that
yeah.
historic town was just leveled, house to house fighting, which is where my great grandpa was killed. But um, yeah, I mean the 30th, goodness
The
gracious.
30th did a lot of house to house fighting in multiple cities, Tessie, St. Lo, Occam, like you said. That's a I don't think any of the soldiers enjoyed or looked forward to. They didn't enjoy, but no one liked house to house fighting.
No, because it's
And,
a
and Forrest
completely
told me
different.
that he was in those house to house fighting there, and that he was a platoon sergeant, and so he's, barking with his men and this and that, and he goes tearing off around this corner on a street corner. And of course, that's not where you want to be. So you want to cross it as soon as fast as you can. And he got bayonet on. This is house to house, like you said. This is up close. And he turns the corner and skewers a German soldier who was running the opposite direction, trying to turn his corner. And they just met at the same time. And that German just went right on his bayonet. And he's just shocked. Oh my gosh,
Yeah,
there's a German on my rifle. And
yeah,
he just kicked him off and then kept going because there was
yeah.
rounds coming down the street like crazy.
Yeah, any combat vet who's had the misfortune of doing that sort of warfare will tell you there's a severe difference between shooting at somebody from several hundred yards away and being close enough to hear their last breath and see their life leave their eyes. It's just traumatically, and just all in all, it's just the worst form of combat is close quarter suburban house. Just and that, and just there's far more places to hide, booby trap. It's just a completely different style of warfare.
Yeah, very brutal.
Let me read.
Roger, before we
Hold on real quick.
go, that
Hold on real quick, Dennis. Let me read a paragraph from
Oh, okay.
about the history of this particular battle. It's just kind of lays down some numbers here. The senior surviving officer, Captain Ronald C. Erickson, took charge of the defense of Hill 314. For 5 days, the approximately 700 surrounded Americans beat off the assaults by the German 17th SS Panzer Grenade Division. Despite running severely low on ammunition and almost entirely lack of food and other supplies, First Lieutenant Charles A. Bartz and Second Lieutenant Robert L. Weiss, forward observer with the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, proved critical to the defense. From their vantage point, preserved today within the park on the summit of Hill 314, they enjoyed a clear view of the Germans' movements on the roads below. Their radio instruction unleashed devastating American artillery salvos against the 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, not only degrading the enemy's assault on Hill 314, but compromising the Germans' efforts to drive on.
Yep.
Wow.
700 men on a hill fighting off tanks and artillery. It's just...
veteran units, fighting off veteran units.
Yeah, that too.
They were fighting them with mortars. They didn't really have anti-tank weapons up there. They were fighting them off with mortars and bazookas and hand grenades.
Yeah. And the only thing they had going for them was on the back side of the hill was the steep grade and the, congestions of the clearing that the Panzers could take. A lot of people have a misconception. Oh, Panzers can knock over trees. Yeah, they can, one at a time at about 1 mile an hour, but you're not fast moving through trees. You got to go through the clear path. And just like anybody knows, if you find a way to stop that first piece of equipment, it's going to stop everyone behind them. And so that was your key goal, was figure out how do we stop this tip of that spear.
That's pretty awesome.
Found an interesting quotation or something somewhere, I don't remember where now, but the Gestapo referred to the 30th Division as Roosevelt's SS.
Oh, wow. Goodness.
That's a compliment, I guess. A
huge compliment, from them.
Real quick, back to the research and development. The first 3 to 4 chapters of this book is really character development, getting Alex and Pete's backstory, their father, Papa. There's so much learning. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Kentucky. I grew up in Ohio. I've never heard of a primitive Baptist. The amount of detail and research that goes into that aspect of it. I'm assuming that when your father came back for the war and obviously didn't go back to Leakesville, didn't really have much to do with your grandfather, did religion still play a huge part in your all's upbringing, or was it tampered down a little bit?
No, it was tampered down. It was a bone of contention between my father and his father. My dad stayed in the Army, and I grew up on military bases. And on military bases, a lot of the churches were non-denominational.
Sure.
There'd be Catholic churches, and then there'd be Protestant churches. So most of my childhood on military bases, my mom took us to, and Dad usually went with us, but we could tell this was not his thing.
Yeah.
But we went to non-denominational Protestant churches on base, and it was something we did as a family, but it was never a major family element of our family.
And so I'd imagine for you to provide the dialogue and the depths in which you did for the character that's based off your grandfather, you probably had to do a fair amount of research on that form of, primitive Baptist, correct?
Well, I knew that my grandfather on my father's side was a primitive Baptist preacher, but I had no idea what that meant. I didn't know that they were untrained preachers. I didn't know what primitive Baptists believed as opposed to the far more prevalent missionary Baptists. So yeah, there was research in that, and a lot of it was pretty head turning.
I imagine.
Um, and then and in reading and doing some of that research, you come across a lot of the biblical references, the scripture that supports the different things that the different religious sects believe. So I tried to wind some of that into the dialogue and into the story. Actually, probably too much. So one of the early things the editors did were make me cut out a lot of that.
Yeah, they gotta save some characters for some more war
They're
descriptions.
brutal. They are so brutal.
Yeah,
Um,
and I always seem to pick out the stuff that I find the most interesting, but that's another story.
well, there's a great line in the book that kind of sums up what you said, where one of the supporting characters said, "You're not one of those people with the snakes, are you?" He's like, "No, we're not that crazy. We're the other crazy." Carrying a firearm daily comes with serious responsibilities. Responsibilities your everyday counterparts may not have to consider. Knowing where you can and cannot legally bring your firearm is crucial. But sometimes, life takes you places where carrying isn't an option. That's where the Stopbox Pro portable gun safe comes in. Securely store your firearm in your vehicle while handling life's obligations. Safety, responsibility, and with peace of mind. Stopbox Pro. Protection when you need it. Security when you don't. For more information, visit stopboxusa.com/D410.
Oh, yeah, no, yeah, yeah, that's right. And between the bundling was something I had heard of before, but I had no idea what that was. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of praised.
Yeah.
The and I'd heard of foot washing. I already always had known about foot washing Baptists, but I didn't really know where those things came from. That wasn't anything I'd experienced growing up.
Yeah, there's a movie with oh, I just completely went blank. The movie takes place around Prohibition. It has the gentleman from who played in Fury, and then oh, anyhow, there's the foot washing is very prominent in that movie. There's some scenes where he's out trying.
Yes, I know the movie you're talking
Yeah,
about.
just
It's they're
Shia
bootleggers.
LaBeouf's in it. Yeah, the bootlegger Shia LaBeouf and the famous British actor. I'm just completely slipped on.
Tom
Tom Hardy.
Hardy.
That is a very very good movie.
Yeah,
And
I enjoy that movie. My wife loves that movie.
the foot washing makes a very prominent scene when he's all drunk on the moonshine.
Yeah.
One of the other
Or
things,
did you ever when did your dad pass?
Early 2000.
Early 2000. Did he ever watch Saving Private Ryan? Did he ever have the
No, he never did. He
yeah,
he suffered from some Alzheimer's for several years before he passed away. So no, he didn't.
yeah.
I know my grandfather got to see it. Sadly, I lived in Ohio at the time. They're still in Kentucky, and from the way my mom and my grandmother described it, was I think he watched it when it came out on video. He wasn't about to go watch it in the movie theater, but so obviously the effect on a early 2000s 27-inch TV doesn't have the same impact as a movie screen. But yeah,
Well, that movie had a very impact that a lot of folks didn't count on, and what it did was it at least I was the beneficiary of it,
it
was
opened them
that
up.
it gave a lot of World War II veterans impetus to tell their story, and all of a sudden, uh, I was lucky because then after that there was a big push for the kids, and the grandkids were then asking Grandpa and Dad, "Hey, what what did you see? What happened?" And so I was the beneficiary of that, and it was like this massive wave of guys who now all of a sudden were willing to talk, and I was able to, obviously we know interview hundreds of them, but I was just, and it seemed to be catalyst seemed to be Saving Private Ryan. That's the
Yeah.
Yeah,
reason
I
why.
could I could see that. It was a very powerful movie, and
Yeah,
Well, and I
yes, sir.
think that was one of the first movies of the subject that didn't come off even the best of movies that we all look back on. The John Wayne movies and all that. That was such a more realistic, more or less hokey Hollywood, you know, representation of their lives, that it was like, okay, we're happy to associate ourselves with this particular style of the project, and now, as Dennis was saying, we have permission to talk about it. So it makes complete sense. Let me ask you a question, Roger. When it came to writing the dialogue from the viewpoint of the African American characters, how do you research and bring yourself to type in the mannerisms and the viewpoints and try to research so that you're representing that in an appropriate and authentic way?
I don't know that I can answer that, although I can tell you it was in undertaking this project, it was my most significant fear that I wanted to be able to tell Alex's story in an authentic way that uh, would resonate with everybody,
Sure.
whether they were white or they were black. And it took a good bit of uh, reflection and consideration to write some of that dialogue. Um, it was helpful to me to know that this did come from my personal family experience. So what I did know about my father and Alex's relationship was, again, all from my father's perspective, but it did give me a feel for some of the experiences that Alex had, and how those experiences must have made him feel. And just and I had to try to put myself in the position of an 8-year-old black boy being discovered in a white man's dairy farm with no other options, and facing the barrel of a shotgun and having to make decisions about what am I gonna run? Am I gonna hide? Am I gonna join this unknown of this family? So I tried to put myself in those positions. Now I can tell you, in the latter part of the book, which is when Alex and Pete kind of reunite at Fort Jackson uh, in the late 1960s. I grew up, my dad was stationed at Fort Jackson in the late 1960s, and I grew up there. Um, so a lot of the experiences of racial intolerance that get discussed in that part of the book were things that I experienced, at least from a white person's perspective.
Sure.
My public high school that I went to, junior high school and high school, South Carolina underwent forced integration in 1970. So busing started, and uh, so that was an experience that I had. It gave me some insight. I played basketball. That was kind of my thing
Yeah.
in high school, and our basketball team got integrated, and I became pretty good friends with the character who's Jacob, who is Alex's son on the basketball team. He was a friend of mine, and we had a pretty good relationship. And some of his observations that come through in the book were things that he shared with me. So I had some family linkage, and I had some personal linkage, and the rest of it was just trying to fill in the story, putting myself in the position of, what would Alex be thinking in response to this circumstance.
No, it's just a question. I'm not putting words in your mouth. Just a question. When you started this writing process, was there a point where you had to say, okay, I'm just going to let my thoughts come out on the paper. I'm not going to self-filter myself. And the reason I say that is I host 3 different podcasts, and one of them is more of entertainment comedian style podcast. And what I discovered early, and plus I worked in radio, terrestrial radio, for 8 years. And so I was on the air in the afternoons saying stuff in real time. And when I first got on there, I would self-censor myself, when talk about my family or my friends. And when you're actively self-censoring yourself, the material that you generate is stifled because you're censoring yourself. And so I got to the point where I had to make the realization, okay, when I'm on the radio, I'm doing a podcast, obviously I'm not going to throw family members under the bus, but I'm not going to self-censor myself so much that the story gets hindered in a way. So when you're writing from his point of view, Was there a point where you had to say, okay, I'm going to let my fears go. I'm going to put this on paper and let the editors, determine if I did this appropriately?
Yeah, I would say I did the other. I don't think I self-censored. I think when I decided to write the parts that were Alex's chapters, and I just said, all right, I'm going to be Alex,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna say what I think he would say, and I'm gonna think what I think he would think, and I'll let the editors and readers figure out if I made a terrible mistake or whether I'm close.
No, I think you hit the mark. And I've learned so much from this book. Obviously, World War II is a huge, huge topic. There's lots of things to learn and cover. I was telling Dennis before the show, one of my favorite parts of your book, I don't know, maybe it's because I do so much World War II based stuff. And don't get me wrong, the World War II based chapters are great, but to me personally, I love the post war stuff. And I think part of the reason for that is usually when you read a World War II based book, after the Japanese surrender in 1945, there may be a chapter on maybe doing some occupational duty in China or something, and that wraps it up. Yours
Yeah.
goes on, briefly talks about Korea, but more interesting, I love the way you discuss, and obviously reason being because you were a teenager in those years, and so you experienced it, but how these characters who joined at World War II in World War II to fight for a cause they believed in and to get away from, a crazy town and a crazy father and caretaker, I guess, to be nice. Caretaker is a friendly word, I guess, for making someone sleep on the porch and giving them some fruit if they bust their ass. But they had a true cause to fight for, and then they stayed in and they're in for Korea. And now Vietnam started out as a true cause, but as the war progressed and more questions started proposing about why are we fighting, and then obviously people trying to sabotage, seeing their characters kind of deal with that dissent and seeing their ranks kind of melt down from what they came up with to now they're like, look at these, and trying to deal with that and maintain that and how you work that into the storyline. I found that is a huge, interesting part of the book.
I appreciate that. I I know that a lot of uh, African Americans stayed in the military, and many of them after World War II and through the Korean War viewed the military as one of the few places in American society where they, were judged on merit, uh, at least in part on merit. Um, but then again, I enjoyed creating that conflict between a grown-up Alex who spent his career in the military and successfully in the military. Not that it was easy, but successfully, and his teenage son, who is very much caught up in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, and which I think were particularly hot topics in the Black community
Sure.
because the burden of the a lot of Vietnam fell disproportionately on Black Americans.
I was going to say, and that's a great point too, opposed to having this argument between a white father and, their white, college bound daughter or son having these conversations, to have the complexity of the feeling of Vietnam War plus the way you're treated on a daily basis because you're an African American in this time. It just, and then having the father figure realizing that, had living through it himself plus worse, but also seeing what opportunities the military provided for them. It's just a huge juxtaposition where even the father character is like, I agree with part of what he's saying, but I still have this role as a father and as an MP and as an authoritarian figure to try to steer his anger in the most valid and most productive way, opposed to letting him spin off and go out with the people that's going to end him up either hurt, hit with a water hose, or in jail. And so that's a huge
Yeah, I
struggle.
wanted Alex to be I wanted Alex to be very conflicted about things, just as you just beautifully described. What's best for my son, and what was best for me and what's best for my son might not be the same thing.
And I also like the way you take historical figures. In this particular case, one of the first doctors who got arrested for refusing to teach Green Berets how to administer field first aid and combat situations, how you took that true storyline and kind of integrated into the book to build a character development and career development for the MP characters. And so
Yeah.
it's fun.
Howard Levy's a little known character, but a relatively famous, a relatively important person in military history and in military law.
Well, the amount of detail you put in, I put the book down and I started Googling. I was like, okay, this really happened. And it was, you're learning stuff, it's historical fiction, but that's because you have historical stuff and fictional stuff to tie it all together. And there's plenty of information to learn. And it's just a damn good story. It's a very good read. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Well, I appreciate that. And I for helping bring other people's attention to the book. I hope they'll read it as well.
I'm sure they will. Once again, we've discussed this in the past. There's so much World War II content out there, but a lot of it covers the same ground. And one of the things we try to do is to, bring different lights on this topic, even if it is, in the format of a historical fiction. Because once again, the historical's there, but the fiction aspect of it, as you pointed out earlier, allows you to take these true stories and fill them in. And because, as we stated earlier, we don't have the history that go along with it. The people who lived them are no longer with us. There's very limited documentation. And so, you have to fill in those points and try to do it in the most honest way. And I think you've achieved that.
Thank you. The along with another aspect of the story that I don't know if you looked it up or checked it out or not, was when I was in high school, we took a field trip to the Bang Village, which was the mock Vietnamese village on the Fort Jackson campus. And I mean, it was I'll never forget that day as long as I live. And I really wanted to find a way to work that into the story, and it did. I ended up being able to find a way to make that part of the story, which I was really pleased to do. But that's another accurate historical element of the book.
If people want to find more information on the book, Boys, where can they head to?
Well, it's available on all the online sites: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kindle, Books a Million. I have a website, rogerbnewman.com, which is my author website, and it gives you some information about all of my books, and it'll link you to a place where you can order any of them.
Roger, is that where you write? Where you're at right now?
Where I'm sitting right now.
Yeah, that's where you write.
Yep. Yeah.
Do you when with your cast of characters and all that? How do you keep track of everybody? Do you do 3x5 cards? Do you have an Excel spreadsheet? How do you keep track of the timeline for the chapters and make sure that everything is justified? You know what I mean? It all is copacetic.
Well, I don't say I do it well, but I try to do it I use yellow legal pad.
Yeah.
I'll flip a yellow legal pad and try to keep track of my characters and where I'm going with the story next and whatnot.
Do you listen to music when you're writing?
Well, I'll tell you, you'll find this funny. Maybe, I don't know. I'm kind of a child, child of a little bit older than you guys, but I'm a TV era kid. I've never been able to work in perfect silence. I need to have something going on in the background.
Yes, sir.
So you can't see it, but right beside me is a television set. And my absolute favorite time to write is on Saturday and Sunday mornings while English Premier League soccer is on. And because you don't have to watch soccer, nothing will happen for 30 minutes and then everybody will get really loud and I can turn and watch the goal and that's great. And then I can go back to work. And
what a great nugget.
The announcers on English soccer, their language is so color, it's not like listening to sports in America where everything's cliche. They say some really fabulous stuff.
And
one of my favorites was, "Oh, a shot across the bow."
Yeah,
And the irony is, ours are called the color commentators, yet we have very little color to add to our
very
commentary.
little color.
You
One
know,
of my favorites, I think I actually put it in one of my early books, is somebody took out another player with a yellow card tackle or something, and the announcer said, "Oh, that was cynical." And I
yep.
just I just thought that was a great way to just it just was perfect.
That's
That's awesome.
definitely a way to describe those of us who were, as the kids say, born in the 1900s. But it's so true what you say about TVs. So we cut the cord a while back. We stream all our services, but we have Roku TVs in just about every room. And one of the things my wife and I do when we're reading, editing editing videos, or maybe we're not feeling well, we just want to take a nap, but we need some sort of background noise to fill out what the kid's doing. Roku TV has the Bob Barker era of The Price is Right. And so we turned that on because growing up, when you were sick, right, you stayed home from school, Bob Barker was on. And so
That's
when
right.
we're taking naps or we're just doing something and just hearing it, watching these old Prices Right from 1978, 1983, it just
Great.
feels like we're kids again. And that's what you expect to hear in the background. Bob Barker, or maybe we'll turn on Leave It to Beaver, or even All in the Family.
Roger, do you read to your wife what you write to test it out? Do you read it out loud sometimes?
Um, all the time. I,
Yeah.
I don't um, I don't necessarily read to her, but when I'll get to a spot where I need help with wording something or picking out the right word, or she can spell, I can't spell.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hollering at her when all over the house, wherever from this spot right here, I'm hollering at her with questions.
That's awesome.
Well, it helps to get an
I
extra
always
set of
loved it.
eyes on things too, right? Because
Yeah, for sure.
you're so dedicated to the characters, especially when they're based off of family members, and you're so dedicated to the time and energy you've put in researching this stuff that sometimes you need somebody with a fresh pair of eyes who maybe isn't quite attached to make sure that the story is going in a way in which it would naturally go. And so that's a tremendous help to have a partner who's willing to take their time and has interest in what you're doing to
Hmm.
read that and to help you out in that manner.
Yeah, she does.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for coming on. It's been great.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Enjoyed the conversation, enjoyed talking about the book. I hope we interest some other people in it,
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
and good luck with your continuing your there's a they weren't the greatest generation for nothing. They did a whole lot, and it's good that you're not letting people forget about it.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Once again, everybody, thank you all for hanging out with us for another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast. Please head over to WTSPWorldWar2.com. Click on that Patreon link, sign up and subscribe. It goes a lot and a far way to help do what we're doing here. On behalf of myself, Dennis Blocker, and Dr. Roger Newman and his fantastic book, Boys, can't recommend it higher. You guys will enjoy this book thoroughly. Thank you guys so much, and we'll talk to you all next week.
This has been a Digital 410 production.